What advice would you give to other product leaders considering making the sort of jump that you made from Bubble to founding your own startup?
I would say dip your toes in the sense of if you are interested in this path, there are actually, I've come to learn, like a bunch of things you can do to kind of just like be more in the loop with the community. Like, for example, attend local events that VCs throw, if it's an appropriate event and you can get on the invite list. Just like go talk to more people who are of the same mind, who are interested in ideas, right? Like start talking to people about your own ideas, like start basically doing light user research or light user validation.
Hey, Alan. So thanks for coming on the podcast today. Now, we've known each other for a while now. We connected through a mutual friend, HBS classmate of yours, and my very best friend, former co-founder from my last startup, Kevin Holub. Because of that, you've been a supporter of General Collaboration since the very, very, very beginning. I think before I even left Facebook, you knew what I was thinking about leaving Facebook for.
Yeah.
And what was really cool is, I don't know, a few weeks ago, we bumped into each other at a startup founder event. You'd shared that you'd left Bubble to start your own startup, and man, congratulations! Like, great to see you on this side of the fence.
Thank you. Yeah, it is truly a small community in New York City, startup land. So really happy we bumped into each other, and happy to be chatting with you.
It's crazy how small it is. Like you're gonna now that you're in it, you're gonna be running, especially like with your HBS network, you're gonna be running into people left and right. It's gonna blow your mind. But man, truly excited for you. I'm really excited for this conversation that we're gonna have today. I've talked to people individually about my thought process and journey of quitting my job at Facebook to start a startup. You've just did the same thing from Bubble. It's I think of like the metaphor of skydiving comes up, and like people who are terrified of skydiving are like, why would I jump out of a perfectly good airplane? We both jumped out of perfectly good airplanes.
Yep.
And this is going to be a really fun, telling conversation, I think, for a lot of people. So thanks for having it with me. Maybe to start, though, let's talk about your role at Bubble. Like, how did you find your way to Bubble in the first place?
Yeah, so I joined Bubble in late 2019, and I've been a product manager before that. And I worked at Google coming out of business school, and then I was at a scaling stage startup called Better Mortgage, all here in New York. And I joined Bubble when they were around 15 people as the first PM, first head of product hire. I got connected to the co-founders by former engineering director back in Google Docs. And honestly, we clicked. The two of them seemed like cool guys, like, really inspirational and visionary founders, but also just like, sane, rational, smart guys. And the product was really, really cool. For those who don't know, Bubble is a no-code tool that lets you build pretty complex web applications. So it truly is a code replacement in many ways. And as somebody who learned how to code on the job at the very first tech startup I worked at, I distinctly remember that experience of learning how to code and feeling like, oh my God, I like learned a superpower almost, right? Like I can take an idea in my head and just type words into a machine and make it real. And then when I found out about Bubble and was trying Bubble out for the first time, I was like, damn, like this is giving me the same feeling, right? It's like with even less effort, I can take an idea in my head and make it working software. A lot of things drew me to Bubble and really hooked me, and it was an incredibly fun ride.
It really is. It's one of those products that when you try it for the first time, and especially when it came out, like none of this is like pre-AI. It truly felt like magic. I think Bubble, like you could count on one hand, like the number of truly magical experiences. And I'd put Bubble up there with like the first time I called an Uber and a car just showed up at my front door. It was pretty wild to see.
Agreed. Yeah.
So how long were you at Bubble in total?
I was there for just a little over 5 years.
Okay. Wow. And maybe walk us through, what's the moment or period when you first started seriously considering leaving to start your own company?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, on the one hand, ever since my first tech job at a startup, which was back in like 2012 to 2014, so, over a decade ago, that's when I really just caught the bug around the energy at startups, right? Like this company was called YipIt at the time. since I left, they have pivoted and they are now called Yipit Data. They're still based in New York. They're doing great. But I joined them back when they were around 25 people. And I just remember having so much fun there, right? Like we were a small team. We were like all hands on deck. I was doing coding. I was doing a bit of data work. I was doing a bit of product work. Loved hanging out with my coworkers. Everything just moved so quickly, and I felt like I was learning so much. So ever since that experience, I knew that a lot of factors around working at a startup really resonated with me. Mm-hmm. And of course, I went on my own journey and wanted to try out, big tech, wanted to try out a more scaling stage company, wanted to be early at a startup to help it grow. And I absolutely learned a lot from all of those steps. But I've always kind of had I've definitely had this feeling that I wanted to start my own thing at some point. Having the desire to start a startup is a great first step, but of course, like, what's the idea that I feel strongly enough about to go after? And honestly, that has been kind of an ebb and flow sort of a journey where mm-hmm. there have been different periods of time where I'm like, yeah, I really want to put in effort to like explore ideas and like talk to more people and hear about their lives, their work, to see like where software could fill a solution, could provide a solution. And I've gone through these like ebbs and flows, or these waves of spending a little more time thinking about ideas, spending a bit less time thinking about ideas. But recently, I think the biggest thing that changed was honestly the Gen AI advancements that really became the center of a lot of tech news, starting around 2 years ago. And I have to admit, at first I was skeptical. I was very skeptical of crypto when it came out and blew up, and I'm still skeptical of crypto, but I was skeptical of AI. And then I began, of course, like trying it out, began learning more about it, began just like seeing what people were doing with it. And like it basically won me over in a sense, or I became more and more convinced that this is a step function change in technology. And it's a matter of like thinking about how can you apply this to different use cases to solve different user problems. So I think that just kind of put me in the right frame of mind. Of course, we were thinking about AI a lot at Bubble as well, which also helped me just like get more exposure to it, like learn more about it, learn more about what it's good at and what it's not good at yet, what it's good at only if you put effort into making it good at something, And yeah, I think as I sort of understood AI more, I just began to think more and more on like different AI powered ideas and like dwell on some of them, right? And eventually I found my train of thought going in one direction. And right around then is when I reconnected with Madrona Venture Labs, which is an incubator or venture studio, where my co-founder and I met, and we're spinning the company out of Madrona Venture Labs.
So had you always been playing around? When you say that these ideas sort of ebbed and flowed, would you just like have an idea that you were playing with and validating and then reach the point of not validation and move on to the next thing? Or what is that process like for you?
Yeah, so dependent on the idea. Some ideas were, I guess I would call them like more validation heavy, where I was, just like mainly talking to people about the idea and like the problem. There were definitely other ideas where I did the opposite, where I'm like, I like this idea, I like this problem, I have this problem, I'm just going to go try to build something like an MVP. And one of the cool but maybe kind of dangerous things about working at Bubble is that Bubble is a great tool for very quickly building a working prototype. And of course, the cool thing about Bubble is that you can continue growing the app on Bubble, but you can also get to a working prototype very dangerously quickly. So my Bubble account is like a little graveyard of different ideas that like, some of which I got to an MVP, some of which I like kind of abandoned halfway. So I do a lot of, or I've done a lot of tinkering on the side with different ideas.
And then you brought up this pretty common line of reasoning that I hear from people of, you'll hear there's the recent college grad, there's like the undergrad, college grad that goes and just starts a startup right out the gate. And then there are people who are maybe a little more cautious that are like, oh, I want to collect experiences first. I want to try startup. I want to try growth stage. I want to go work in big tech. I know you had that journey of collecting a lot of those experiences. Was that intentional, that you felt I need to do this before I'm prepared to found my own thing? Or was it just that you didn't have the idea worth walking away from any of those jobs from until now?
Yeah, both, I would say. I think by personality, I am definitely naturally more of a risk averse person. So like that, that metaphor you were giving at the beginning around like, starting a startup is like jumping out of an airplane, like leaving a well-paying job and starting a startup is like jumping out of an airplane to skydive. When I heard that, I'm like, yeah, I would never skydive. Like I have no desire in life to skydive, like zero desire to skydive. So yeah, personality wise, I'm on the risk averse side, and, having gone through the different experiences I've gone through, like it's very tempting and satisfying in a very different way to like collect these experiences, right? It's like, oh yeah, sure. I just need to learn like XYZ skills, and then I'll be more well-rounded to start a startup, right? And it's very easy to fall into that line of thinking. But then that feeds into like, okay, cool. If the mindset is, oh, I still need to learn these 4 more skills, then you're probably not going to be, where I found I was not necessarily as motivated to really think about an idea, right? Looking back on it, like I definitely learned a ton from every job I have had. Like, no question about it. Like, I've gotten to learn and do so much in each job, and all that should be very helpful for the startup, for sure. Right? There are some things which just come almost as like second nature to me now because I've like done it in a job before, right? On the other hand, there are still going to be a lot of other new things that I'll need to do for the startup. So it's like, it's basically impossible, I think, to gather all the skills you'll need to start a startup. And so in hindsight, if I had come up with an idea that, I was really passionate about and motivated me maybe like 2 or 3 jobs earlier, like, yeah, I probably could have / should have just gone and tried it, but yeah, doing it now in my life journey. So,
and then you call that being relatively risk averse. So how did you evaluate the risk? How did you evaluate this opportunity? Like what framework, if any, did you use to make this decision?
Yeah. So on the one hand, I think I went through at least the line of thought of being like super rational about it, right? Like thinking about pros and cons of doing this now versus like, other types of jobs I could have or like career choices I could make, right? I thought about like the financials of it, the family financials around doing this, right? I have built like a Google Sheets model of our family finances and like, tried to figure all that out. So on the one hand, I did a lot of these like rational decision-making things. At the end of the day though, I think it was almost more of like an emotional turning point, where I was like doing all this like rational work and thinking. And then I realized at some point, it's like, okay, this is not going to get easier, right? It is not going to be easier to go and start a startup in 2 years, 4 years. Maybe it'll be easier in like 15 years. I don't know. But it's not going to be easier anytime soon. And if I've always wanted to give this a go, and now I think I have an idea, or I do have an idea that I feel much strongly about, why not just give it a try now, right? Why not go for it now? So it was kind of when that switch flipped in my head that I decided, yeah, now's the time to do it.
I'd love to hear a little more about that like family math. So I went through the same thing. Like thinking back to my first startup, I was a snot-nosed kid just out of college. I had no responsibilities in the world. Versus now, you and I both have young families. It's not, you got to make a spreadsheet. You got to be really thoughtful on how were you going to be able to support your family through this.
Yeah.
How did you work through that? Like, what were the conversations like with your partner to get both of you on board to do this?
Yeah. So luckily my partner, Max, has been very, very supportive along the way. In fact, he probably wanted me to do this even before I convinced myself to do it. Yeah. He's probably like, I'm tired of hearing you talk about startups all the time. You should just like go do this now. Yeah. So he was very supportive from from the get-go. Of course, we still had to like sit down and like talk through the details, right? We're fortunate that he's in a fairly different line of work at a much bigger company in that different line of work. So basically like diversifying our, risks, so to speak. And yeah, because he's at a bigger company, we hope that means it's relatively stable, right? That of course helps. We looked at how much money we have saved up. We looked at kind of our monthly expenditures and figured out like, we don't want to all of a sudden just like go on a ramen, lifestyle, right? But like, yeah, there are things we can be conscious about, like not overspend here or there. Like we literally went through and canceled a couple of like streaming TV subscriptions. Every little bit helps. Yeah, and we kind of looked at the numbers, and we're both the type where like we like seeing numbers, but at the end of the day, we know that like numbers kind of like point to the right direction, but like reality plays out very differently sometimes and messily. So we talked about it. I mean, in our case, we also have a young child. So our son Ian is currently 3.5 years old, and we love living in New York City. So on us to live in the like one of the highest cost of living cities in the world. But yeah, no, we looked at all the math, we did the calculations, and we figured out like, okay, without drastically changing our lifestyle too much, like this is roughly the amount of time where this could totally work out fine, right? And even in the worst case, if like everything implodes tomorrow, for example, here's how much runway the two of us would have if we had zero income all of a sudden, right? And so actually kind of like doing that math, like actually made me feel a lot better in some ways because, in my head, I thought, oh no, the number was like much smaller, but actually like, it was like a fine number at the end of the day. And it helps give a bit of context around like, here's what the next like 1, 2, 3 years might look like trajectory wise. Honestly, another factor which really helped in the whole calculus is of course like learning a little bit more about how the finances and the math of running a VC backed startup actually play out, right? Because you're not on zero comp if you are successful at raising funds. So we did decide early on, my co-founder and I decided early on to do this through an incubator, which of course means we are on the VC-backed path. So, that is an important factor in the family model as well.
Yeah, that was certainly the hardest part for me as well. And me and my wife Meredith talking through at that point. She wasn't pregnant yet. We have our 6-month-old son now, but he wasn't even dot on the radar at that point. But figuring out like exactly like you said, how much can we afford to reduce expenses? We don't want to live anywhere other than New York. I think one of the biggest things for me too was, and this is kind of like PTSD from one of my previous startups, was at a previous startup, I just, talk about burning the candle at both ends. I just threw the whole candle in the fire at the end and literally ran the bank account down to zero. And this time I'm like, okay, at what point is this point of no return where like, I need to pay myself severance because like I need to get a job. And just having that, like, what are those safety blankets that you can grab onto that'll make you feel like, okay, like what does my worst case scenario look like? And if we reach that, how do I know that I'm there? What actions do I need to take? And when do I need to take those? It's tough. It's cool to hear that you were having all those thoughts, especially as a first time founder. That's really cool to hear.
Yeah. I'm actually curious, like, if you're willing to share, like, what did the investors of that first startup think? Or did they react when you were thinking about winding things down and like thinking about the finances?
So this is my third startup now. The first startup was acquired and we were running on fumes to that point of being acquired. Yeah. And at that point, I was just a kid. I was the youngest person on the team. I actually had moved in but both of my first startups, the office was my apartment. And both of those startups ended with me moving in with a teammate and like literally living on their couches. One of them was Kevin at the second startup. So that one failed. And Kevin Kevin and Fanny were living in a studio apartment, and I lived on their couch. The worst part was I'm like very, very allergic to cats, and they had a cat. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
But it was just, we were younger and naive, and we thought like, oh, if we can just get one thing to work. And like what we should have done is just been smarter about like, okay, this is how much severance Kevin is going to need to find his next role. This is how much severance I'm going to need to find my next role. We had a third co-founder, William. How much severance is he's going to need to find his next role? And this time around, like as I built my model, there's kind of this kill switch of I have my like, I track where our runway is, but I also track like at what point is this point of no return, where if we cross this dollar threshold and we do not have these numbers at that point, we need to, there's actually two. There's one, like if we have not started fundraising and we're at this dollar amount, and if we're at this dollar amount ever. And those are kind of the tripwires for, okay, it's time to unwind this. As far as like how investors reacted, I'm sure it varies investor to investor. I've been very fortunate each time around. With my first startup, we did wind up getting that one acquired, but they were super supportive of like, maybe not. They were somewhere between like, they were supportive of me. They wanted to see the company acquired, and maybe they did kind of push me to like run the company on fumes and go down to, there was a point where I was like literally using the McDonald's app, which has coupons in it. And I would go and buy something and then get back in line to buy something again, so I could use multiple coupons. And like, that was how tight we were at that point. The second startup was like truly understanding, where there was this conversation with one of our lead investors. It was like, this 9 out of 10 startups fail, and yours is one of those. And like, I'm not going to lose any sleep over this, because I knew that 9 out of my 10 investments would fail. Go and do what's right for you. And they were super supportive of helping. Like we had run it. We'd given ourselves more of a haircut than we needed. We ran it closer to the edge than we probably should have at the end, but that was on us. They really were supportive of us walking away safely. And this time around, I had that, like, now having a young family, had that conversation up front of like, they know what my priorities are. And like, at the end of the day, my priority is being a dad, is being a husband, is my family. And this is number 2, where before it got to be number 1 because there wasn't anything else. I think most investors understand that these days. Also, the amount that like you can compensate yourself as a founder has gone up. I think the average is now probably around like 150, even 200, where before it was just the de facto number was 100. And like, you certainly can't live in San Francisco or New York on $100K salary. Not these days anyways.
Not with the family, especially. Yeah. One thing I didn't fully appreciate until, I got more into this world this time around, or this time, is there's just a lot more diversity of like life stage in this case, in terms of founders nowadays. I think it's, at least from the outside, it was kind of easy to like, scroll through LinkedIn or like read the news, and you hear about, I'm going to pick on like YC, but you see all these like YC founders who are like 1 to 5 years out of college, like kind of extolling this startup founder culture of like, all of our employees moved into the same house together, and like, we just work on this 20 hours a day. And like, that's great. Like, a lot of them are putting in a ton of hard work. But also, like, I've met a lot of other founders who are at very different stages of life. And I think it's cool to see how the tech and startup industries have kind of evolved. And there's just a lot more diversity now. And like, of course, everybody works hard at their startup. It is everybody's baby in a way. But people are in different life stages.
I wonder if I feel the same way, but I question, is it just that I wasn't paying attention when I was younger? And like, I only saw the other people that were my age, and now I'm seeing people who are my age today. Like, I wonder if I would have found something 20 years from now, like, oh, there's a shit ton of 55-year-old investors here, or 55-year-old founders here. Like, that's probably there probably always were those people. We were just so narrowly focused on the people in our friends groups.
Yeah, that's a great point.
What so far, I know it's early in your journey, but what's been the hardest part? Like, what was the hardest part so far of leaving that, jumping out of the perfectly good airplane, leaving a stable, pretty prestigious job?
The hardest part was honestly just like firmly making the decision, like in my mind, in my heart. It's like, even after all that, rational, like financial model making and talking to my partner and weighing the pros and cons, even after, that emotional switch I mentioned where I'm like, okay, it's not going to get easier. I should just do this now because this opportunity has come up. I love this idea. It was still like kind of, it took a bit of it wasn't scary. I wouldn't call it a scary decision, but it was definitely more of like oh shit, I'm about to make a big decision real, right?
Yeah.
And to like give notice. And certainly like none of the conversations were dramatic, right? Like had a really great conversation with Bubble's co-founders about the decision. They were super nice and supportive about me deciding to do this. That's like scary, right? To make a big decision real.
Was that the definitive moment for you, like giving notice?
I think so. Yeah, that was the first of a few different definitive moments I've had in the last few months. But yeah, that was definitely a key moment. And then from there, like a lot of stuff just like started unfolding, right? And like, of course, we were like kind of shaping how some of it unfolded, but like stuff had to get going, right? Like stuff had to move on. So
yeah. So let's talk about what you're working on. What's this startup? How did you identify the problem? Let's hear the story.
Yeah. So the company is called Liminary, and Liminary is the cognitive companion for knowledge workers. So if you look at knowledge work today, right, we believe that it's fundamentally broken because knowledge workers across all different kinds of industries, including what I experienced in my past jobs, including likely what you experienced, knowledge workers are just kind of drowning in information coming from left and right. We spend a lot of time wrestling with scattered links to useful artifacts, we juggle screenshots, we juggle a bunch of different tools that we have to use for work. And later on, we still struggle to retrieve information that we've seen before when we actually need to use it, right? So Liminary is letting you seamlessly save information and research. And then we're doing something revolutionary, which is we proactively work alongside you, and Liminary will connect and surface the right pieces of your knowledge to you exactly when you need it. So that's our idea that we're building out. That's our vision. And as I mentioned before, we are coming out of Madrona Venture Labs. So this is an incubator that's part of or a subsidiary of Madrona, the VC firm. And they had started kind of playing around with this idea, this problem space about a year ago, honestly. And as they were kind of building conviction around the problem space, I'm like, yes, there's something here to solve. They first recruited my co-founder, Sarah, who was leading ML engineering at Dropbox's core product. And then she worked with them to recruit me on board. So I joined as CEO. And Sarah and I kind of took the idea, took the prototype that had been built to date, and we officially spun out as a company.
Wow, that's awesome. That's really awesome. That's such a big problem, such a big problem space. Where do you start?
Yeah, we both love the problem space. I mean, like to take a step back, like this was one of those things where, like, as I was thinking about AI and like AI's latest capabilities, at some point I came to the realization, it's like, oh wait, like AI like actually understands stuff. Like it actually understands knowledge and like what's being written down, and now of course like other file types as well. And then that's the kind of thought that just like made me pause in my thinking, and I'm like, oh, that's really new, and like that opens doors. So that was kind of the origin of my fascination with this, and of course that it can go in so many different directions from there, right? So for us originally, we love this idea of like, what does it mean to work with knowledge, to work with content, to work with especially your own knowledge, right? And we feel like that's a pretty big difference from working with a company's knowledge writ large, right? Like enterprise knowledge management has been a problem that people have been trying to solve for a little while. There are a few different players out there that try to do that. But for both Sarah and me, like, what tools does an individual have at their disposal, right? Like, sure, you have tools like Evernote, you could argue Google Drive does this too. You can like put information in, and then you kind of have to like rely on like search features or your own organizational system in order to more effectively use what you've saved later on, right? And that was kind of the root of where this whole idea started with MVL as well. It's like, okay, well, you can save information, but then like, how do you more effectively use it? And then as we kept digging into it, as we talked to more users and just like people out there about like, how do they approach this problem today? We realized that like, it does feel fundamentally broken. Like nobody really has a great solution to this, either in terms of a tool or in terms of like a manual process that they've pieced together themselves. So A, there's no great solution. And B, people are really frustrated and people generally think this can unlock a lot of value for them. We kept pushing and kept honing the idea.
So far, how is your experience going from head of product at Bubble now to founding your own startup? How has the head of product experience influenced your approach so far?
Yeah. So on the one hand, there are a lot of core skills and approaches and philosophies even that are very similar, right? It's like being incredibly user-centric, like really wanting to talk to users about them and their problems and what are they doing today and what are they frustrated by, and trying to just like really listen deeply to what they're saying, right? In the case of going from 0 to 1, the kinds of things you're trying to listen for in the feedback is a bit different, right? Because you're kind of trying to spot similarities in how people are talking about the problem, spot opportunities for like, what's the shape of a product or a potential product that can solve this. I do find that specific part to be quite a bit different than working on like one plus a product that already exists and you're improving it, right? So yeah, a lot of core things about the product management discipline definitely apply. But then I think there are, of course, a bunch of other skills you need. So pretty much as soon as a lot of what we've been doing for the past couple months is fundraising. And that is a very different skill, I've come to learn. It's a very unique skill, a very different skill. On the one hand, it is about like storytelling and being able to clearly articulate like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? How do you plan to solve it? What's the plan look like? What's the strategy? Which all kind of resonate with PM skills. So it's not totally foreign, but like, I'm sure you experience this too. Like fundraising is kind of its own beast, right?
Yeah.
Like, even though I rationally knew what would happen in the fundraising process, I don't think I was like, I didn't know what it would feel like to go through it. So we've been spending a lot of our time doing that. As of time of recording, thankfully it's wrapping up. And I'm sure the next month, next 3 months, next 6 months will look very, very different. But I'm curious on your end, like you've been through fundraising a number of times now. Like, what's it like going in and out of fundraising mode?
In one word, distracting.
Yeah.
So similar to you, like at the end of the day, I'm a product guy. And the role that I tend to play, at least at the earliest stages, is that product management role to my team. But also CEO, fundraising falls on your shoulders. For me, I think the biggest challenge was in product management. So much comes down to, at least my approach always, so much comes down to prioritization and just being extremely ruthless in like what's going to make the cut, what's not going to make the cut, super, super prioritized, and really focused on like what's right in front of us and not getting caught up in the longer term vision, especially in a startup. You don't have time to dream about what you're going to do a year from now because so many things have to go right for the next few weeks for that even to be a remote problem. Right. Fundraising requires an entirely different type of storytelling. And you do want to dream big and people do want to hear about that, like, multi-billion-dollar vision and not, well, we're going to build this and we're going to ship this feature and X, Y, and Z are going to happen. Toggling between those two modes was always something that I struggled with. It's just like my rational, pragmatic approach to the rest of my life and like to product specifically, you can't do that there. Like a lot of times I feel like, especially when I was younger, like earlier startups, it took a while for me to realize I'm pitching the small version of this. I'm pitching like the near term version of this, and I need to pitch the big version of this. That was a really hard lesson for me to learn. With general collaboration, very much learned how to pitch the big version, and we had a much easier time fundraising this time around than with previous startups. There's a variety of factors that went into that beyond just that like realization of storytelling, but that's been the hardest. And then to your point of it's like you just said, like what you have been doing for the last few months is fundraising, and it is wild how much, if you're fundraising, you're not focused on your business. Those two things, it's hard for them to exist in parallel. At the earliest stages right now, like effectively the race hasn't started until you say it starts. So it's kind of okay. But once that money's in the bank and once you're burning a runway, at some point your team's going to go without their CEO, without their product manager for 3 to 6 months, because you're going to be focused on fundraising and they're going to be doing God knows what. Hopefully you have a good enough roadmap to guide them and can burn the candle at both ends and still go home and be a good dad at the end of the day. It's that's where things get really hard fundraising wise. Did you have that same, like, what's your pitch been like? How's your pitch evolved? I think when we caught up in person, you had said that your pitch had recently evolved from being focused on like a niche into a larger vision. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. First off, everything you said like resonates so much. We definitely evolved our pitch a couple times in the process, and I'm like trying to find the right verb for it. Like it definitely wasn't like these were not full on pivots, right? Like we weren't like every couple of weeks just like completely pitching a different idea or anything. But yeah, no, we were kind of getting feedback from investors. We were like thinking about the feedback and also honestly comparing it to like, what we were hearing from users and seeing like, oh, okay, actually, this point makes a lot of sense. Like maybe we need to tell this part of the story differently. Maybe we need to focus on this other part of our plans, not this original thing that we thought was cool. And it's kind of this process of like tweaking and like trying out different stories and like, we've tried versions of the story where like I tried it for 2 pitches and after 2, I'm like, no, this is definitely not working. Need to revert back to the last version. And it's fascinating because like the pitch by the end of our process sounded very different than the pitch at the beginning, but like of course like the heart of the idea was still largely the same, right?
What were the initial assumptions that like, sounds like there were some initial assumptions or initial framings, positionings that you realized were wrong? Like what specifically changed that unlocked the fundraising that you're now, fingers crossed, going to be able to close?
Yeah, so I'll give like a big example that immediately comes to mind is originally we were pitching that our starting target ICP would be the creator economy. Okay. And so we thought, okay, cool. Like we see a lot of work product that these creators are doing. So we're thinking like newsletter authors, bloggers, podcasters to some extent. From what we see them publish, like they're obviously going through this workflow, which our tool is going to help with, right? They're doing research on the topic. They're saving a lot of information. They need to synthesize it. And then they need to create a blog post or like a podcast script or a newsletter based on the research, right? And we're like, amazing. So the pure form of the workflow we want to solve, like these people are very easy to find because they're all public with their work.
So which is it? Are creators not a sexy market, or is it too small of an initial wedge? What was the feedback? I think it has to be one of those two.
The feedback was a little more the former. Like we learned that the creator economy is kind of treated as a very unique industry. A unique group of users. And now that we've heard a little bit more and like we've talked to a couple of these folks, we're like, okay, we see what people mean here. There are unique things about being about targeting the creator economy. Plus, also, frankly, that is one of the industries where you have a more significant leg up if you've worked with that industry before, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
And my co-founder and I we just don't come from products that targeted the creator economy.
Yeah.
And then like, as we kept digging, we're like, oh, okay, there are some other like pretty strong reasons to not go for them first. Like one being, a lot of them are kind of more solo users or like work in like very small teams. Whereas we do want to lean into more of like the collaboration and like, a land and expand motion for our idea. So yeah, we de-emphasized them. We chose different ICPs, which honestly were more similar to the ones that we had worked with as founders in the past as well. I still like harbor this dream of like, okay, cool, we'll just land like one really notable podcaster or like newsletter author, and they'll put us in their newsletter, and it'll be great, and we'll like get 100,000 users. But no, it's not going to be our focus.
How are you thinking about go-to-market? Is that like what's most on your mind right now? Are you focused more on how you distribute this product? Are you focused more on the product itself? Where are you spending your time in these like initial early phases? Or has it just been all fundraising and that's kind of a tomorrow?
Yeah. We have been doing a lot of thinking about kind of the plans from here and like laying some of the groundwork. So my co-founder, Sarah, comes from an engineering and an eng management background, but she like has managed PMs before. She's worked on user-facing features. She's a great product person as well. She might not admit it, but she's a great PM in secret. And so she's leading the charge on kind of like product development, engineering, of course, and building out the product. And I'm definitely involved, but more kind of like giving feedback and like helping influence decisions and things like that. And I'm more overseeing like go-to-market and of course like all the operations that have to happen. So I'm thinking a lot about what are the different like tactics we want to try, what are the ones we are going to put into place now versus in a couple months when we have more beta users versus a couple months after that when we are much closer to our public launch. Honestly, I'm having a lot of fun with it. Like there are a lot of just like fun things that I was definitely adjacent to, but never got to do myself at Bubble, like running the company blog, right? Like, I think that'll be a lot of fun, actually. And yeah, just so many plans. We're now at the stage now that we're wrapping up fundraising where I'm like, we have so many fun plans. We need to prioritize, right? That's my PM instinct coming out. We need to like prioritize and like create a roadmap and like figure out exactly the sizing of each of these different initiatives and so on.
So you mentioned a few of them, but I'd love to hear more of like what skills do you think you have to develop quickly as you step into this new role? Like what juxtaposing to the Bubble role? What are you going to have to do now that you've never done before or that you've only been slightly a part of before?
Yeah, I would say what's top of mind right now are a lot of the marketing subdisciplines, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a lot of stuff where, again, I've been like adjacent to or I've like participated in, but I've never driven myself before, right? Like product positioning, right? Like classic product marketing functions and responsibilities, right? Definitely been very involved with them. Definitely, worked with PMMs to influence these answers, of course. But now I have to drive it. Mm-hmm. A content strategy, an SEO strategy, thinking about partnerships and how to approach potential partnerships. What are some other ones?
Is there anything that, like looking back now, that you wish you had done differently, or skills that you wish you had that you haven't gotten to flex yet or gotten to try yet to prepare for this founder role? Anything that you wish you did?
On the one hand, I mean, this kind of goes back to an earlier question you asked. Like, on the one hand, it would have been lovely if I had a prior job where I was doing marketing, for example, mm-hmm. or like any subdiscipline within marketing. On the other hand, that's very much along the lines of thinking where it's like, okay, cool. If I just collect enough skill sets along the way, I'll know all the skills at some point, right? Yeah. And that's certainly not a way to construct a career if you aren't going to do your own startup, right? It's like, okay, I'm going to jump from PM to marketing to sales next to whatever. So yeah, of course, like if I had done this exact kind of function before, like, cool, I would know how to do this by second nature now for my startup. But I had different experiences, and there are a lot of things I don't have to worry about as much, which is great. And I can just kind of like do them. And then there are going to be ones like a lot of these marketing subdisciplines where like I have to kind of figure it out and I have to try to remember all the great stuff that my past companies did and what did those people do, and honestly reach out to some of those past people and like ask them, and then just give it a go myself.
Any I felt like tactical mistakes. Any tactical mistakes that you feel like you've made so far that maybe cost you a month plus of progress, that, you know, giving advice to others that follow in your footsteps that others should avoid? Any missteps that you've made so far?
Yeah. We haven't been going at this full time for that long, so thankfully, I hope no mistake cost us a couple months already. But even like in the fundraising process, right? Like looking back on it, I know why we didn't do this time around. But looking back on it, I wish we had followed that piece of advice that you'll see online around like, okay, compose a list of all the potential investors you want to talk to.
Didn't do that.
And tier them out, right? We didn't do so much of the tiering them out part.
Got it.
We did it a little bit, so it wasn't like we completely missed this, but like we could have been much more crisply defining the different tiers and then like ordering them much more militantly. I think in retrospect that actually would have helped.
So one of those like, oh crap, we shouldn't have had the first meeting be with A16Z and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Actually, yeah, no, there are a couple particular investors I have in mind, like one which we were at the event of. Don't put that part in there. Where like, looking back on it, I'm like, damn, I wish they were not in the first like 10 meetings. I wish they were in like the last 10 meetings.
It all comes down to the relationship building too, though. Like totally different. So the investor that we're talking about is Flybridge, who's an investor of mine. Mm-hmm. And ironically, you feel like you pitched them too early in the process and they saw this, incomplete version that didn't land so well. And then you never got a second shot on goal. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, how you were saying that like ideas ebbed and flowed and you'd play around with startup ideas, every stupid idea that I had, I would grab a coffee with Jesse Middleton and tell him about those dumb ideas. And it was actually Jesse being like, no, that was good. You should quit your job for that one. That finally pushed me over the edge for GC. So it really isn't,
amazing.
It's kind of like, I don't know, hindsight's 20/20, because it could have totally gone the other direction of him being like, well, I saw the dumb version of this, and now I can't imagine the great version of it now that you're,
that's fair.
Relationship building is such one of the new challenges that you're going to have to deal with now is thinking about this round is done, thinking about the next round. How much time do you spend building relationships with the investors that could work for the next round? And what sort of access do you give them? Because you could turn them off and they could get this warped perception of what you're working on now. Or it also becomes a time suck. It's all time management.
Yeah. Out of curiosity, like order of magnitude wise, how many dumb ideas or just ideas did you pitch before pitching GC?
Jesse, I was fortunate where like that's a true friendship, where maybe he has a lot of people, maybe he has a lot of like budding startup founders that feel like they're friends with him and they come and grab a coffee and tell him about all their ideas. So he knew both the ideas that were more fully baked that I was actually doing research on and other ideas that were like, hey, have you ever heard of anybody doing this? Is this stupid? So he literally saw it all. I can think of 4 like ideas that I went deep on, was doing research, was talking to potential users, was trying to get smart on the industry that he had heard about that like could have become things. And there were some of them where he was like, no, I wouldn't invest in something like this. And here's why, or like, that's interesting. I don't know. Or like, I don't know about that space. But he got sort of the full view. There is another investor who I didn't have as strong of a relationship with, who similarly saw the evolution of general collaboration where, today we are this one inbox for all your work discussions. There was an earlier version of it. Back then I was calling it Alchemy. And it was a word processor. It was GitHub for product management. And effectively it was a word processor with like better version control specifically for PMs and product teams. And they could not get over what that was. And I was like, no, that's not the thing anymore. I don't even call it that thing anymore. And like, well, we like it, when you lose somebody like that, you lose them. And so it really does come down to relationships, which is why it becomes so hard to figure out how much time do I spend building relationships now that I've founded the company in the lead up to the next round.
Totally.
A lot of management of time and resources for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So maybe one final question as we kind of wrap things up here. What advice would you give to other product leaders considering making the sort of jump that you made from Bubble to founding your own startup?
Yeah, I would say dip your toes in the sense of, if you are interested in this path, there are actually, I've come to learn, like a bunch of things you can do to kind of just like be more in the loop with the community, you know, like for example, attend local events that VCs throw, you know, if you can kind of, if it's an appropriate event and you can get on the invite list. It's like, just like go talk to more people who are of the same mind, who are interested in ideas, right? Like start talking to people about your own ideas, like start basically doing light user research or light user validation. And I think as soon as you start taking those first two steps, I think you'll learn a lot, not just about like particular idea or particular investor or what have you, which is all useful, but also about yourself and how you're resonating with this journey. And I think like as you learn more about what this concretely looks like this path concretely looks like, it might help dispel some myths or concerns, or on the flip side, it might help you better realize what are the true things you should watch out for and think about ahead of time before making the decision.
Yeah, those are two really good call outs. I think there's one with people that are coming from a prestigious role, a known role before. People are somewhat hesitant to put themselves out there, and there's some real fear there. I know, like when I was starting to think about quitting my job at Facebook, the last thing I wanted to have happen was have anyone at Facebook find out that I was thinking about that. That could have been terrible for me. But to the extent that you can, let small circles, let this startup world know that you're thinking about this, it's going to make your life so much easier. It's like you're a professional athlete that, like, once they know that you're going to be up for free agency at some point soon, they're going to want to get to know you and build a relationship. In that moment that you're ready to go, it's like, oh, this is my chance to invest in Alan.
Yeah.
I know he's a smart guy. I know he's doing all this amazing stuff at Bubble. If I want to be part of Alan's team, I need to get in now at the ground floor. A lot of people are so cautious, and it limits their ability to leverage that. Like, had a product at Bubble. That's a big freaking deal. The fact that someone that was working on such an awesome product is now founding their own startup, that's a once in a lifetime opportunity for an investor. So getting yourself out there in a way that makes them feel that way, and that gives you the exposure and makes you feel more confident making that decision. Great advice.
Yeah.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for having this conversation and being so candid. This was really great. I also appreciate all the questions that you asked me. Made for a really fun back and forth. Any final thoughts that you want to share? And then also, where can people follow you, get to know you, get to know the company, get to start hounding you for roles? Because I'm sure people are going to want to come and work for you after hearing what you're working on.
Yeah, feel free to find me on LinkedIn, add me on LinkedIn, and check out our website, liminary.io. Liminary is LIMINARY.io.
Awesome. Thanks again, Alan. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
And this is fun.
Excited to keep seeing you around at New York startup events too.
Yeah, for sure. See you around.
Thanks.